and a special thank you to Mr. Chandler for providing me with this very, very good opportunity to share with you what I've learned over years of research about the United Nations Global to Local Action Plan for Sustainable Development called Agenda 21, and how sustainable development is transforming our community. First, I'd like to say that if you're looking for someone who's opposed to zoning and planning, you're not going to find one here. I absolutely do support zoning and planning, and I commend all of you. I know you work very hard, you have a lot of workshops to attend, a lot of information to absorb. I know that there are a lot of state and federal mandates that are placed upon you, and you have to figure out how to sort those out and how to abide by those through your planning for our local community. But what I want to share with you today is something that we don't hear about at the local level. In fact, we don't hear about it at any level of government, and it's largely hidden, and I'll reveal why that is so. But first, I'd like you to meet a few people. Let's begin with Betty Perry of Orem, Utah. You'll notice she has a wound on her nose. That happened when armed code enforcement officers took her down on her front steps and arrested her for not watering her lawn. Now, it wasn't that she didn't want to water the lawn, but she was on a fixed income. Everything had increased in price. Her cost of living had risen, and she simply couldn't afford to spend money for water, to water the lawn. This is one of the minor cases. Meet Jacques and Marcel Dupuis of Llano, California. They lived out in the desert, where they built this beautiful little cottage. They thought this was where they would retire to. They got all the necessary building permits that complied with code, and they, of course, being in the desert, you can't exactly drill a well. There is no public water. So they were approved for a water tank. But when there was a code change that required a water treatment system, they simply couldn't afford it. So they weren't grandfathered in. The water tank was not grandfathered in, which is what one would expect. But they were forced to dismantle every board and nail of their home. In Dade County, Florida, 1,500 people are losing their homes and businesses because the EPA came in and told them they were residing on wetlands, even though the Army Corps of Engineers did a study and said it was no wetlands. And they are ongoing in court with their battle today. Then in King County, Washington, owners of 5 acres are losing the use of 65% of their land due to something called the 65-10 rule, where 65% of their land has to remain natural and undisturbed. It made front page news when they delivered 17,000 petition signatures to the county courthouse. And now for one a little closer to home. Greg Garrett of York County, Virginia. He's a real estate broker, and when real estate went soft and the market crashed, he decided he would supplement his income with an oyster farm and would sell oysters to the community and even exported oysters. He got all the necessary certifications, licenses, and permits from the state to grow, harvest, sell, and even export his oysters. And as you'll notice, his land here is right there at the mouth of the York River, where it opens to the Chesapeake Bay, and even leased the property for his oyster farm from the state. Now, his land is zoned agricultural, and according to the federal and state government, aquaculture is agriculture. But local code changed the definition, and aquaculture was no longer considered agriculture. So they ordered him to shut down, and they have a court case pending now. This is the kind of thing that we see happening all over America. Some of it very major, some of it not so much, some of it you all have absolutely no control over at the local level. It's the federal government. In fact, most of it you don't, because you take your direction from federal and state government. But this is the kind of thing we've seen happening. So it deserves a closer look. these issues need to be addressed. Because one thing for certain, property rights in America do matter. It was so important to the founders. They believed that the right to own and control property was essential to liberty and prosperity. And it was so important that they protected property rights in the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. But I can tell you, America is unique in this respect. Other nations absolutely do not believe as we do. In fact, there are many nations who will take your property, like Panama, for instance. The government can take your property without notice and without compensation. I want to first look at the origins of sustainable development. So we'll go back to June 1976 at the UN Conference on Human Settlements in Vancouver. They issued a 65-page Vancouver Declaration, and the section under land in the preamble is very telling. It says that land, because of its unique nature and the crucial role it plays in human settlements, cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, and therefore contributes to social injustice. If unchecked, it may become a major obstacle in the planning and implementation of development schemes. Social justice, urban renewal and development, the provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interest of society as a whole. It goes on to say that excessive profits resulting from the increase in land value are one of the principal causes of the concentration of wealth in private lands. Therefore, government should recapture excessive profits due to increased land values to redistribute to the public at large. Public ownership of land should be exercised in favor of the common good, rather than to protect the interest of the already privileged. Attention should be paid to the separation of land ownership rights from development rights, the latter to be entrusted to a public authority. Now, all of this doesn't sound like anything we would hear about in America, but I assure you it's something that has been coming at us, and I'll explain how. Meet Gro Harlem Brundtland. She is a major player in the plan for sustainable development. She's the former Prime Minister of Norway, very popular lady. In fact, she was the minister 3 times in Norway. She's also the Vice President of the World Socialist Party and the Chairman of the Brundtland Commission. And we'll hear more about the Brundtland Commission. In fact, many federal agencies talk about the Brundtland Commission, particularly the EPA, in some of their documents. But what I found interesting also was that in the United States, there is a Socialist Party. Now, we all think of the Democratic and Republican parties, so I was amazed to hear that the Socialist Party is in the United States as well. And to understand the type of sustainable development that these people are talking about, you first must understand the way they think, the things they say, because that is reflected in the plans that they draft that essentially were adopted by the United States. On the World Socialist Party of the United States' own website, it says that the World Socialist Party of the United States is part of a global socialist movement that believes capitalism cannot meet the needs of the majority of the people in the world, however progressive it might become. To meet these needs, capitalism must be replaced by socialism. Well, that's fine. You know, I have nothing against socialism. If it's for them, let them take it. But that's not what the United States was founded on. And we were given inalienable rights. We weren't given inalienable rights. We have inalienable rights that are protected by the Constitution. But they don't think the way we do. The General Assembly for the United Nations asked the Brundtland Commission, of which Ms. Brundtland chaired, to take the principles of the Vancouver Declaration and develop a strategy for reducing poverty. And so at the 1987 UN Conference on Environment and Development, they released a plan known as Our Common Future. I have a copy of it here. You can purchase it online. Our Common Future describes sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, that sounds pretty good. In fact, I pretty much like that. Except when you read a little further into their report, you realize the meaning behind it for them. Another quote I found in the book is, "Poverty is a major cause and effect of global environmental problems." So now they're linking poverty and the environment. Now, in looking at earlier documents, I know that socialism is something that there were socialists trying to bring their ideology to our country. And then on the other side, we had environmentalists who wanted to preserve all of nature and rural land. But they were at odds with each other. And they absolutely did not work together. They were arch enemies. But after the Cold War, the socialists thought, well, you know what, maybe we should bring the environmentalist in. And here's where the link comes in with poverty and the environment. And they began to work with environmentalists and made environmentalism the excuse for bringing about their ideology in America. The book goes on to talk about the importance of creating equity or social equity, also known as social justice, through the proper balance of economy and environment. They also provide the data from the World Bank for the per capita of the GDP by groups of countries. And they go on to talk about the methods for reducing poverty, in which they say that you must take the wealth of the wealthier nations and transfer that to poorer nations. So this was their plan for reducing poverty. And they intended to use land use as a means of doing that. So they took these ideas to the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, where they were also asked to develop a strategy for worldwide sustainable development by the year 2000 and beyond. And at this conference, there were 18,000 people in attendance, many from the United States. The then President George H.W. Bush was there, the future EPA administrator, other government dignitaries and department heads, as well as many leaders of environmental groups. Maurice Strong was the chairman of this conference. He was also the director of the UN Environment Program, the chairman of the World Wildlife Foundation, and a member of the Brundtland Commission that produced this report. He was a very interesting character. He became a billionaire very young in life. He made millions by his mid-20s. He was an oil tycoon. He even bought 200,000 acres of land in Colorado, over the largest water aquifer in the United States, and made tremendous wealth over piping that water throughout the southwest of the United States, until the environmentalists kicked him out, which was kind of interesting, because just 3 years prior to that, he was the director of the UN Environment Program. But that wasn't the end of his shenanigans. Anyone here heard the oil for food scandal? Well, it seems he was connected to that, and he was run out of Dodge. In fact, he fled the United States and Canada. He went to China to avoid prosecution. But in his opening speech at the conference, he said that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, the use of fossil fuels, electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable. He goes on to say in a subsequent interview during the conference that isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilization's collapse, isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? Pretty stunning comments, certainly not the way we think here in America. And so they presented, or unveiled, the global to local plan known as Agenda 21. Here it is. And the slide you see is the cover page on the United Nations website. And in their very first paragraph, they state that Agenda 21 is a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations system, governments, and major groups in every area in which humans impact on the environment. Now, I don't know of too many ways that humans don't impact the environment. In many ways, we impact it in a positive way, and in some ways negative. However, this at least tells you how all-encompassing this action plan is. In its preamble, it says that we are confronted with a perpetuation of disparities between and within nations, a worsening of poverty, hunger, ill health, and illiteracy. However, integration of environment and development concerns and greater attention to them will lead to the fulfillment of basic needs. No nation can achieve this on its own, but together we can, in a global partnership for sustainable development. The developmental and environmental objectives of Agenda 21 will require a substantial flow of new and additional financial resources to developing countries. Excuse me, I'm getting a little dry. In its 40 chapters, Agenda 21 addresses virtually every aspect of human life. It particularly addresses a plan for the control of land use, housing, transportation, food production, consumption patterns, water, energy, education, the role of business and industry, and healthcare. 179 nations agreed to adopt Agenda 21, and President George H.W. Bush was a signatory for the United States. So they have a plan, but it's a soft law. So there's nothing binding, and they needed a way to make it reality. So they came up with a convention on biological diversity and a treaty, and they provided a report. They provided a report that they said was conceived as a practical tool for translating the principles of Agenda 21 into reality. That report was the Global Biodiversity Assessment. It's an 1,142-page document, and I haven't read all of it, but what I do know about it and what I have read are what they say are the unsustainable human activities. Any skiers here? Because on page 337, they say that ski slopes are unsustainable. Backyard garden ponds are unsustainable. Pastures for grazing cattle is unsustainable. Golf courses are unsustainable. Highways and transportation by car is unsustainable. Dams are unsustainable. Our system of justice is unsustainable. Consumerism is unsustainable. They say that even the family is unsustainable, that we need to reduce the population to 1 billion. And currently we're at 7 billion. So it's interesting to know how they plan to do that. Single-family homes are unsustainable. And they go on to page 993, where they reveal a plan for what they call the Wildlands Project and its counterpart, Smart Growth. Now, under this project, they call for 50% of the American landscape to be rewilded or remain natural, to provide wildlife corridors and reserves. The areas you see in yellow would serve as buffer zones, where there would be very highly regulated use, limited use, something like some farming, some recreation, but very restricted, limited use. And the areas you see in green would serve as those areas for normal use. That's where we would live. Ideally, they would like us to live in high-density urban transit villages, where we use primarily public transportation rather than driving cars. Now, when this map was presented on the US Senate floor in 1994 by Dr. Michael Kaufman, who was also a former congressman, the US Senate voted not to ratify the treaty. It was tabled and never even voted on. Now, sustainable development is illustrated to depict the proper balance between equity, economy, and environment. They say to achieve equity, the individual must give up personal wants for the needs of the collective. Economic policy calls for the international transfer of wealth, and free markets are replaced with public-private partnerships. And individual rights are subordinate to environmental needs. So we'll examine that a little more closely. To achieve social equity, or what they call social justice, they'll use law to restructure human nature. Again, so that individual wants will have to give way to the needs of the collective. Meet Harvey Reuven. He was a member of the ICLEI Executive Committee, and we'll hear more about ICLEI in a moment. He was the clerk of the courts of Miami-Dade County. Remember the 1,500 residents who are losing their property in Dade County? You think they'll get very far with a lawsuit? He was the chair of the Climate Change Advisory Task Force, and he was the keynote speaker for the Rio 10 Summit. The Rio 10 Summit was the 10th anniversary of Agenda 21. In his speech, he said, "The American system of justice may be changed to conform to that of the rest of the world, must be changed to conform to the rest of the world. And there must be a shift in attitudes. Individual wants, needs, and desires are to be conformed to the views and dictates of government planners. In the process of implementing sustainable development, individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective." Now, who says stuff like that in America? But he's an American now. Now we're not talking about the socialist from the United Nations. This is an American. Their economic policy, again, calls for the transfer of wealth that comes from the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, Article 8, where they state that equity will be achieved through the transfer of resources to developing countries. And they advocate public-private partnerships. In fact, they believe that all business should be through public-private partnership. The problem with doing that is, as I'm sure you all know, a public-private partnership is when there is a unique arrangement between a private business and government. They have this mutual arrangement. The company is awarded tax breaks. The government shares in the liability. They have easy access to federal funding, and many times it creates monopolies. They almost always receive government subsidies, and they get very large government contracts. They make a lot of money through public-private partnerships. The problem is that when we have too many of those, free enterprise begins to topple. They have to assume all the tax liability. They have to assume all other liability. They have very limited access to federal funding. They have to compete with monopolies, which kind of leaves them out of the game. They don't receive subsidies, so the cost of doing business is much greater, and they struggle to survive. Their environmental policies place nature above man, where individual rights are subordinate to the environment. They take from Principle 1 in the Rio Declaration that human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life. When someone entitles you to something, they can take it away. I entitled myself to a healthy and productive life, thank you. And this says that the only way I'm entitled to it is if I'm in harmony with nature. I'm sorry, I take exception with that. But to achieve a sustainable development, States should reduce and eliminate sustainable patterns of production and consumption. Well, that sounds pretty good, but remember all those things they said were unsustainable? On June the 14th, 1993, the White House issued a press release announcing the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And in this press release, they outlined the primary goals. And the very first one here is to respond to the recommendations in Agenda 21, the comprehensive international policy declaration nations of the world agreed to as a pledge to global environmental action, and contribute to the U.S. plan to be submitted to the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, the international commission created at the Earth Summit to help ensure implementation of Agenda 21. 15 days later, President Bill Clinton issued Executive Order 12852, which created the President's Council on Sustainable Development. Now, the Council was responsible for taking the policy recommendations set forth in Agenda 21 and translating them into policy to be administered by federal agencies of the government and what is called the Sustainable America, a New Consensus. I have a copy of it here. The United Nations was delighted about this, and they even reported it on their website. Created by a 1993 executive order, the President's Council on Sustainable Development is explicitly charged with recommending a national action plan for sustainable development to the President. The PCSD submitted its report, Sustainable America, a New Consensus, to the President in early 1996. In the absence of the multi-sectoral consensus on how to achieve sustainable development in the United States, the PCSD was conceived to formulate recommendations for the implementation of Agenda 21. So now we brought it to the United States. We didn't ratify the treaty. It was a soft law. So now we've decided that we'll use an executive order and use rulemaking authority through federal agencies to implement the actions. So why haven't you heard about it? Why is it that every local government is in the dark? All of the planners are in the dark. I was in the dark about this until a few years ago. Well, this gentleman explains a little bit of that. His name is J. Gary Lawrence. He was an advisor to the President's Council on Sustainable Development. He helped draft the Millennium Papers. And in those papers, he states, participating in a UN-advocated planning process would very likely bring out many who would actively work to defeat any elected official undertaking local Agenda 21. So we will call our process something else, such as comprehensive planning, growth management, or smart growth. And here's how they're doing it. They dangle grants at very needy local governments with strings attached. And though there were 12 cabinet agencies who were members of the PCSD, at least these 6 provide the local grants that are driving this, and without your being aware. In fact, the Department of Transportation refuses to even give you money unless you go along with the Sustainable Communities Program. The EPA, they show their commitment to Agenda 21 in the Federal Register, Volume 63, number 163, on page 45,157. They say that the Sustainable Development Challenge Grant Program is also a step in implementing Agenda 21, the Global Action Plan on Sustainable Development, signed by the United States at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. How many of you have heard of the Sustainable Development Challenge Grant? Anyone here? It's been provided at the local level. They also reported again on January 3rd, 2012, where they state that the EPA's path forward, now this is a a new program, their path forward, has begun to address this need for systematic incorporation by realigning EPA's entire research enterprise around the concept of sustainability. This has required agency scientists and managers to recognize the widely used definition of sustainability outlined by the Brundtland Commission in 1987, meeting the needs of the current generation while preserving the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. To fully embrace this definition, the three commonly recognized pillars of sustainability, here we go, economy, environment, and they're saying society, social equity, society, social justice, have been systematically integrated into EPA's research portfolio. The American Planning Association received $500 million to provide the Growing Smart Legislative Guidebook. Now, they're a leading organizational member of the Planners Network. And in the statement of principles on their website, they say that we believe that planning should be a tool for allocating resources and developing the environment to eliminate the great inequalities of wealth and power in our society. We believe that planning should be used to ensure adequate food, clothing, housing, medical care, jobs, safe working conditions, and a healthful environment. We advocate public responsibility for meeting these needs because the private market has proven incapable of doing so. Well, excuse me, but the last time I checked, I could go to a private market and buy my food or clothing or housing. I could get medical care, and they provided jobs. And of course, we have rules and regulations that provide safe working conditions and a healthful environment. The APA also adopted something called the precautionary principle. Now, this principle has also been adopted by every federal agencies of the government, and in fact, you see it in a lot of plans. It essentially says that where threats of serious or irreversible damage to meat or to people or nature exist, anticipatory action will be taken to prevent damage to human and environmental health, even when full scientific certainty about cause and effect is not available, with the intent of saving the quality of life for current and future generations. This is from the Rio Declaration, Principle 15 and Agenda 21, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Saying pretty much the same thing. So this again goes back to the precautionary principle use. So even if they think, like those 1,500 people in Dade County, even if they think it's a wetlands, they don't have to prove it's a wetlands. If they think it is, the precautionary approach should be taken. The American Planning Association also advocates something that I find the most disturbing. And there are a lot of things I could pick on with the American, but this is the most disturbing. Something called the amortization of non-conforming uses. Now, you know, why be concerned about that, right? We have a constitution that protects our property rights. But for homeowners who live in a community that adopts the guidebook's vision, the APA amortization proposal means that the extinguishing over time of your right to occupy their houses and without just compensation for loss of that property, how long they have before they must forfeit their homes would be completely up to the local government. Now, this is in Chapter 8 from the Growing Smart Legislative Guidebook. I do have the 2-volume set. I didn't bring it. It weighs about 12 pounds. It's 1,500 pages. This is the cover page. But in Chapter 8, it says specifically, a local government's zoning ordinance may state a period of time after which non-conforming land uses, structures, or signs, or designated classes of non-conforming land uses, structures, and/or signs must terminate. I find that very alarming. And they themselves concede that this could pose a constitutional challenge. Other ways that Agenda 21 is being promoted and legislated in the United States is through UN-sanctioned NGOs, mostly environmental and wildlife groups. And while they do a lot of wonderful things, they're also pushing this agenda. And they spend many, many millions of dollars lobbying Congress and legislatures, and as well as local governments, because they see this whole thing as the best chance they've got of protecting the environment. Now, I'm not suggesting that I don't support protection of the environment. I don't support environmental extremism. Here's another NGO that's very helpful in implementing Agenda 21, ICLEI. They are actually the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. That's where the letters ICLEI come from. Today they call themselves Local Governments for Sustainability. And they have the task of mobilizing and technically supporting local Agenda 21 worldwide. And they say so in their own publication of the local planning guide, local Agenda 21 planning guide. And it was published by them. Their name is on it, on the bottom. But they now, since so many people are waking up and talking about it across the country, they tried to scrub their website of Agenda 21. I can still find it on there, but they tried to scrub the website, and they totally deny any connection to the United Nations and Agenda 21. And you don't just pay dues, membership dues. In fact, it's local governments who are members of ICLEI. And in Virginia, we have 14 of them. There used to be 18. But 4 of them voted to discontinue their membership once they realized what was really going on. But you don't just pay dues. You have to also agree to a resolution pledging to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they have a 5-milestone process. This describes that process. Education is another way of implementing sustainable development policies. And at the 2003 International Conference on Education for a Sustainable Future, 2005 through 2014 was declared the decade for education for sustainable development. UNESCO was named the leader in this effort. UNESCO said at the conference that the decade of ESD is a far-reaching and complex undertaking that potentially touches on every aspect of life. The basic vision is a world where everyone learns the values, behavior, and lifestyles required for a sustainable future and for positive societal transformation. So they're agreeing that this is big, and it affects every aspect of life. But it didn't stop there. Through No Child Left Behind, they extended it to K through 12 public schools. In Virginia, we call it Greening Virginia's K through 12 schools, and they have ongoing case studies and surveys to track the progress of sustainable development in the curriculum. And essentially what it is teaching them social justice principles. So the Convention on Biodiversity, you know, that treaty that was never ratified, well, things weren't going quite well as they would like. With Rio Plus 20, the 20th anniversary of Agenda 21 coming up, and the conference that's about to occur, a lot of pressure has been put on President Obama. And in June of last year, he issued Executive Order 13575, which created the White House Rural Council. And it essentially gave him authority over all food, fiber, and energy in the United States. And of course, the problem with this is that it's not happening primarily through legislation. It's happening through federal agencies, agencies of the federal government using rulemaking authority. And in March of this year, for the counterpart, Smart Growth, Obama issued Executive Order 13602, creating the White House Council on Strong Cities and Strong Communities. In 1994, the Virginia General Assembly created a task force to study Sustainable Development, Agenda 21. And in 1997, they issued to the Governor and the General Assembly their report, House Document Number 6, that outlined the concept of sustainable development, Agenda 21 origins and policies, the current sustainable development initiatives, sustainable development projects in Virginia, and a strategic plan for Virginia. And of course, what we're seeing is some of the framework now in many of the laws that are being passed through our General Assembly that really contribute themselves to the Wildlands Project. I've outlined just a few here. Urban development areas, which I'm very proud to say is now, after this past session, optional rather than mandatory. The Open Space Easement Act, the Conservation Easement Act, the Purchase and Transfer of Development Rights, and wetlands mitigation banking. We even have a Virginia Wildlife Action Plan, which is okay by me, except that it says that programs that provide technical and financial assistance for habitat conservation and restoration on private lands are vital to sustaining Virginia's rich and diverse wildlife resources. Well, I find that a little disturbing. We can have habitat conservation on public land, but on private land? What does that mean, and who makes that decision? And let me also say that there are many other pieces of legislation contributing to this. I just highlighted the most important ones. But now let's look at what happens at the local level, where you have an opportunity to do the planning. But you've got all of these regulations happening that you have to consider when you're drafting the planning for the local community. And so I'll set up a scenario for you. Grandpa Jones has a 1,600-acre farm. It's been in the family for 3 generations. The Jones kids are all grown now, and they've left the community. So Grandpa Jones decides to sell the family farm to retire. XYZ developers offer $1.6 million for the property, and they've got a great plan. They want to rezone 1,400 acres to residential. They'll rezone 200 acres to commercial. They'll set aside 100 acres of the residential property for a future school. They'll hold it up to 10 years and sell it to the school board for the same thing they paid for it originally. They'll build 3,250 new homes, and they'll build a 200-acre shopping center. They'll bring new jobs to the community. There's more than enough revenue coming in to cover all the infrastructure needed for the development. Sounds like a win-win for everybody. Except the comprehensive plan says that the Jones farm is outside of the urban boundary. Utilities cannot be extended. 20% is dedicated to the county for public use. 500 acres is a protected area. Open space provision allows only one structure per 40 acres on the remaining land, so only 28 homes can be built. Well, that's not a very good deal. So XYZ developers abandon the project. There's lost revenue for the county, no new jobs, no retirement for Grandpa Jones. The land is stripped of its value, and the county owes Grandpa Jones nothing. Folks, this is equivalent to social engineering. And that's how they propose to do what is done. So, and what happens is it forces all future growth, even though it's not mandated by any legislation. This type of social engineering drives all future growth to high-density communities, and the result is this: the biodiversity plan that was never ratified by Congress. And what is the remedy? Well, first, you can avoid accepting grants with sustainability strings attached, but most importantly, use coordination. Congress specifically set forth criteria as to the duties an agency must carry out under coordination. Federal agencies are required by federal statute to coordinate with local governments. And we have an expert here among us. I'd like to introduce you to Joe Garino. Joe, will you stand up, please? Joe is an expert on coordination. Now, coordination is used by federal government to push all these things on us. But we can also invoke coordination to push back at the overregulation by federal government, and as well as state government. Am I correct about that? State government as well?
Yes.
So if you're interested in knowing more, see Joe at the end of the program, or you can contact me. My contact information is on the back of the handout, Part of Sustainable Development, and I'll be glad to put you in touch with him. So now we must decide the direction for the future. Will we choose the vision for sustainable development or the vision of the founders? You have a right to own property, or you become property. Thank you.